Hello and welcome. I'm Kelly Hammock, Senior Client Solutions Manager at L&E Research, and we are so happy you could join us today. Before we get started, I want to mention that we are recording today's webinar, and that will be made available via our on-demand page at leresearch.com. We will be taking questions and answering them at the end of our discussion, so please use the Q&A function on this platform. It's going to be down there in the menu to post your questions. We will be collecting and posing these to our panel at the end of the discussion today. And if we can't get up to all the questions, we will answer those in email afterwards. If you would like to say hello, share where you're joining from, or share your LinkedIn, please use the chat function to do so. And remember, you can chat to only the presenters or to the presenters and attendees by making that selection in the chat window. Today, we're going to be discussing healthcare research and the adaptations that were implemented when the world changed a few years ago. We've gathered a panel of experts that have extensive experience on this topic. So let's get started with meeting our guest speakers. Tell us a little bit about yourself. So Stephanie, you want to get started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Larson. I'm a managing human factors specialist at Emergo by UL. And at a high level, Emergo by UL helps medical device manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and the like to develop safer and easier to use medical technology. Been in the business for about 10 years now, and one of the main types of research that we conduct is what we call usability testing. So where we have people come in person and interact with the various products that we're researching. So because of that, COVID was a big impact for us, and that's why what I'm here to talk about today.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Amy, how about you? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Amy. I'm a research associate at the Health Services Program at the American Institutes for Research. AIR is a not-for-profit organization that conducts behavioral and social science research and delivers technical assistance. AIR is based in DC, and we have offices all throughout the country, but most of our workforce is largely remote still. And so today I'm zooming in from my home office in Seattle. Within our health division, we have a number of research, evaluation, and technical assistance projects that work to advance care that is equitable, high quality, affordable, and patient-centered. Most of what I'll be sharing today is from our Translation Center project, where I'm the cognitive testing lead. What we do is essentially translate clinical research results into summarized abstracts easily understood by patients, caregivers, and stakeholders. Our ultimate goal is to publish these online so stakeholders can make informed healthcare decisions using up-to-date and accessible research. So I'll just pause there and hand it over to April.
My turn?
Go ahead.
All right. So I am very excited to be here with you all today as well. My name is April Leonard. I am the Director of Medical Operations for L&E Research. I oversee a team of 11 now medical market research professionals who are highly specialized and trained in supporting clients such as Stephanie and Amy in the recruitment, but not just the recruitment, also the consultative support of clients conducting qualitative market research within the healthcare scope. I've been working in the market research industry for nearly a decade, but I'm a registered nurse by trade. I spent 12 years as an acute care nurse prior to joining L&E, and it's just been a real blessing to be able to combine that clinical experience together with market research to help bridge barriers within clinical insights as they arise. So look forward to talking a little bit more about that later.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. So since some of our discussion today is around adaptation to research methodologies over the past few years, let's start by setting the stage. Here at L&E, as was the case with many qualitative researchers, roughly 80% of our clients' needs were in person. We had experience hosting interviews virtually, and we have built great relationships with a variety of technology partners, meaning we had solutions in place to give our clients choices on how they can effectively conduct their research. As a very fortunate bonus, the majority of L&E staff are remotely based across the US and have been for over a decade. So we already had a structure and metrics in place to keep our business moving forward. Our guests today have different experiences, so I'd like to start by hearing about that. Amy, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do at the American Institutes for Research and what adaptations you had to make when stay-at-home orders halted in-person research?
Sure. So we were very lucky, at least for this project, that we had very minimal changes. So I'll dive a little bit deeper about what our cognitive testing looks like. So like I mentioned before, we work to translate clinical research results from studies funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute into plain language summaries written at about a 6th to 8th grade reading level. So we are actually in the 7th year of this project and have produced about 400 summaries to date. So cog testing in this context is kind of like an interview method, figuring out the thought processes and the reactions that people have as they read information. So we're looking to identify the reader's reactions and like perceived usefulness of each summary, specific comprehension issues and suggestions for improvement. Typically, cog testing is done in one-on-one interviews, either in person or virtually. But for our project, we conduct most of our cog testing asynchronously via email. So we have our own database of about, I'd say like 160 clinicians, researchers, patient advocates, and patients. And we invite them to review our translated summaries, and then they provide feedback on clarity and comprehensiveness. We do also work with L&E to recruit a couple patients with specific conditions for certain studies that compare 2 or more treatment options for specific health conditions. But all of this communication and review processes are, like I said, conducted over email. So we share the translation summary and the reviewer form, which has a standard set of questions about the clarity, the content in each section, as well as like some questions regarding specific issues that came up in the translation writing process. And then the panelists complete the reviewer form in like 2 to 3 days. They email it back to us, and then we kind of synthesize their feedback. So this has been our process for way before the pandemic. It continues to be our process. So our work fortunately transitioned with minimal difficulty.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. So it does sound like your experience was really similar to L&E's in that you were already conducting your research remotely and you just had to make minimal changes. Stephanie, you had a very different experience. Emergo by UL was conducting a lot of research in person, as you said. So can you talk about that transition? What did those first few months look like?
Yeah, so the vast majority of our research is in person. That's the best way for us to understand how someone's interaction with the product is to just see them in person interacting with the product. So March 2020, when COVID really hit and people basically went into lockdown, we were kind of at a standstill. And I think everyone had the same experience of like, okay, is this going to last a week or a couple weeks? Or is like, that's kind of what we thought at the beginning. So it's like, okay, we'll just pause. And then when it seemed like it was going to last for a long time, as it has been proven to, we had to think about how to make the show go on, basically. And we didn't want to just halt our research and halt our business. So we had to think about some different solutions. There were different types of remote research that we explored. And once travel bans were a little bit looser, some different ways where we could include some remote moderating from sort of like the back observation room of L&E research in similar facilities. I'll dive into the details a bit more later, but basically it was incredibly disruptive. We had to think creatively about different ways for us to proceed in conducting research.
Thank you, Stephanie. So over the past year or so, and I mean those of us in the industry, not just specifically L&E, we've all questioned, when will in-person research return? The short answer is that it didn't really stop. It was just what I like to call fit for purpose. Simply put, some research must be conducted in person. Device testing and sensory research are just a couple of examples. April, I briefly shared L&E's process, but can you talk a bit more about L&E's experience as it specifically relates to healthcare research?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Kelly mentioned, we saw the flip. out of necessity that the industry as a whole experienced over the past 3 years. And I did pull some numbers just out of curiosity, and also have some optimistic numbers to share already into 2023, specifically related to healthcare and medical market research subject matters. In 2019, we were about 26% remote research, and then that increased to 53%, as Stephanie mentioned, due to all the events in early 2020. So 2020, we sat around 53%. 2021, that increased even further to 62% online. And then in 2022, with the relaxing of local mandates and travel bans, we saw that dip back down to about 58%, which is still pretty high. But the good news so far, just 1 month into 2023, we're finally seeing, at least at LNE, that script flip. And we are trending about 52% in person, 48% remote so far this year. So that said, I firmly believe, and we'll dive into this a bit more, but there's some research that we do not see fully reemerging, to answer your question, Kelly, on trends, just from lockdown. Clients were forced to adapt and to keep that forward momentum going. And in doing so, figure out oftentimes at a pretty hefty cost to their bottom line. So definitely something we're continuing to monitor in order to best be able to support the needs of our clients based on the trajectory of the research moving forward. But I am optimistic that more in-person is reemerging, and the numbers are proving that way so far this year.
Thank you, April. I like those numbers. It's very optimistic. So I appreciate you sharing that. And thank you, Stephanie and Amy, for sharing as well. This is really great foundational information for this discussion. So moving on, Amy, AIR had to make minimal changes due to existing remote research process that was already in place. Did you find that the participants recruited for the research had to make any adaptations? And if so, what did you do to increase their accessibility?
Sure. So our email review process is fairly accessible, especially for our own panelists who have been reviewing for multiple years now with us. And so we made very minimal changes to the process for our internally recruited participants. However, like I mentioned, we do recruit with you guys. And so sometimes those participants don't necessarily have access to computer, and we don't want that to be a barrier to participating in our studies. And so we have always offered a phone interview. And then with the pandemic and stay at home, we didn't bring our office phones with us. And so the only change that I think we kind of included was just using an online or desktop version of the phone just to make external calls. I think the platform we use is Ring Central, but I'm sure there's others. Yeah.
Thank you. And then Stephanie, healthcare device testing is literally hands-on. So obviously the shift away from in-person testing was a challenge. How much of a variable is the device being tested when it comes to designing the research?
Yeah, so, it was at a high level safer to conduct remote research, but in some cases that just wasn't feasible or not possible. So in our industry, earlier stage research, when the product is more in development, is more exploratory, and there's fewer rules surrounding that, as opposed to when you're trying to do research when you feel the product is sort of complete and we're conducting what's called a validation test, so validating the design. So if a company was earlier in development with their product, that made it more feasible to do remote research because the data collection methods could be slightly less rigorous, shall we say. The other consideration in terms of the device type is sort of the size and feasibility of being able to ship it to people. That's something that we did, especially with home use products like a pre-filled syringe or an inhaler. Those types of things are relatively easy to ship to participants that are recruited for a study and then conduct the study, like this through a computer, versus some of the larger products we work with, or products that are more expensive where it's not possible for a company to just ship, a product that's costs $10,000, $20,000 through the mail.
Thank you. And so April, we had to make some shifts of our own to continue to provide that high level of support our clients are accustomed to receiving. So can you share a bit about some of the strategies and alternatives that were implemented to keep our clients researching?
Yes, absolutely. Lots of shifting, lots of innovation. So we had numerous large scale and also some more simplified, but just simply not previously necessary innovations that were born quickly in 2020. So the first Stephanie has touched on is remote moderation. I think that this is the big gun. We often found ourselves in the predicament of being able to fully recruit a study for in-person research. Respondents were willing to come into our office. They were willing to comply with the PPE requirements, any testing or vaccine requirements. However, the clients were on travel bans, and the travel bans, they went on for a while. So they could not themselves get to us, and especially impacting our international clients. So we came up with a plan to mobilize smaller groups of trained team members in each of our markets with facilities to essentially be our clients' hands, while they were then able to join remotely and be the voice, eyes, and ears of the research. That was hugely successful and allowed us to continue to kind of push research through even kind of the most daunting of situations. From there, we developed a virtual facility, LNE Research's virtual facility. This facility was staffed by expert level technical support who are available to assist clients who had successfully converted their study to remote methodologies, but did not themselves have the manpower or knowledge, or even, let's frankly, the desire to run the technical aspects of the study. So from the pre-study tech checks to the technical hosting, any session related technical troubleshooting, AB needs, so on and so forth, the known Achilles heels to remote research, we were able to take that on for our clients and really take that work off their plate in order to allow them to fully focus on data collection and not the tech involved to get there. And that is something that will be ongoing into eternity, is this facility offering, because we found that even clients who were previously remote have really benefited from having this taken off of them. Another avenue we deployed that Stephanie also touched on, and also the pain points of it, but we promoted and well supported the home use testing. Now, HUTs have been around since the dawn of market research, but we were kind of coming at this particular approach specifically to the transfer of work that was once viewed solely as in person. So, you know, shipping a syringe to a physician's desk, shipping a smaller device to a therapist's office, shipping, a label or whatever to a patient's home. This was very successful, however, did have its own challenges. Of course, we cannot ship, certain levels of machinery. And also, if anybody recalls, the Postal Service, all matters of mailing also went a little sideways and was quite unpredictable, especially in the latter 2020 and early 21 months. However, with length and lead time and proper expectations set, we were pretty successful with this approach out of necessity during those early years. So that was something else we were able to kind of use to our advantage. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on the paperwork. I will have to say this was probably the most unexpected and arduous impact to us, working mostly in the project management world. During the first few months, it kind of just like hit us in the face. In medical market research, as we all know, there is an ICF, an ATP, a Sunshine Act reporting agreement, an NDA for everything, and appropriately so, but then not to then touch on proof of prescriptions, proof of diagnosis, physician verification forms, and contributing documentation on top of it. So when research suddenly jumped from 26% to 62% online, so did all the accompanying signatures and paperwork needed from recruits. So with the volume of respondents we recruit and speak to, manual back and forth for scanning and wet signatures, not an option. One by one e-signature requests, not an option, not realistic. So we had to come up with a way to mass execute the receipt of thousands and thousands of documents, and then routing those quickly and efficiently to the correct projects and sponsoring clients. So we did it. It was daunting. It was a process, and now it's full steam ahead. But establishing that process was critical to the success of efficiently executing the influx of remote market research. And I'm sure anybody on here who works in project management or in this type of role will agree that the paperwork is something that is not often talked about, but was a huge, huge daunting task for anybody doing this type of research during those years.
Thank you, April. I didn't even think about the paperwork process and how much of an ad that was. I mean, just designing the research itself is an undertaking, and then all the little nuances. It's fabulous. So Stephanie.
I should say one more thing,
sorry.
Kelly, on that. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Even in-person research, because we were trying to be as contactless as possible, we were still tasked with trying to get everything signed ahead of time. So don't forget that, yeah, 62% we were online, but that other percentage, I'm not doing quick math in my head right now, but that other percentage, we were still having to get the paperwork done ahead of time. So it was a lot.
April, did you say that in some cases you were not able to do digital signatures, or did I misunderstand that?
There are some clients that do require wet signatures. So yeah, and just trying to come around with a solution to that with the mailing situations as they were, but just even coming up with a way to mass execute, because doing the one-on-ones, you know, recruiter to respondent for thousands and thousands just wasn't going to be feasible, or just a one-on-one e-signature request also is not realistic. So figuring out how to mass get signatures and documentations and was quite the process.
Yeah, I bet. We have relatively minimal paperwork, it sounds like, compared to some of the types of paperwork that you mentioned. But from an L&E client perspective, it was very easy for us to share our informed consent forms, and then magically people would sign it ahead of time. So that was very convenient.
Well, that's the goal. So I'm glad that was the interpretation.
Thank you. And Stephanie, so I believe you have hands-on experience with the remote moderation that you and April had talked about, and not just in an L&E facility, but elsewhere. So can you tell us about your experience?
Yeah, so I've touched on some of these styles of research already, as is April, but I see three main types of remote research. So one was shipping to people's homes, which was in some cases, as I've already discussed, like not possible for logistical reasons, for sometimes legal reasons of not wanting the product like out in the environment. And it did pose its own challenges. You know, when you have someone come to an L&E facility, there's a certain level of sort of like control you have over the environment. And so we were having to adapt to learning how to sort of set the stage, make sure that people were planning a quiet time in a dedicated space and didn't have distractions. And so thinking through sort of a new environment for people to be interacting with us. But of course, the benefit with shipping to people's homes is that the research can more easily happen, especially when the travel bans were in place. Another thing we did was when research in a particular location, for example, like Raleigh is a hot spot with you guys. Like if you guys said we could get enough people to Raleigh, but our moderator couldn't travel to Raleigh, there were times where the participants would come in and L&E would manage people coming in and getting set up and like kind of setting up the room and the setup, and then the moderator would be calling in to conduct the research. So again, big benefit in that you can conduct research even if travel restrictions were in place, but still some challenges with not having, again, quite the same level of control you do if you're in the room with someone. And then the last sort of style that we developed, which is continued on the most frequently, I would say, is, I don't know if you'd fully call it remote, but we adapted to running the sessions rather than, you know, sitting at a table with someone in the main research room. We were behind the one-way glass in the observation room. And this allowed us to, you know, be on site, to set up the room, to configure things how they should be and adapt if needed, but still have that separation of the one-way mirror. So, you know, in the days of the social or physical distancing, it just took that out of the equation. Like we weren't even in the same room as people. So that was, as far as like visibility and adaptation, that was sort of the easiest. But we definitely had to work to get our proper like AV set up and our good angles and all of that kind of thing. Because we're so used to interacting with people face to face.
On those remote, you know, behind the glass, were you conducting, so you would be moderating from behind the glass, were you using like a video conferencing software to communicate with the person in the room?
Yeah, we did it a bunch of different ways. We used video conferencing software. so they could see our faces, like even though we were just behind the glass, like doing something like this, even if we're 10 feet apart, just so you could see that there's a real person. At times we would leave the lights on in the back room so they could like sort of see through the glass. So that was an option. We would put some other things we did were like put pictures of our unmasked faces on the desk, like in there with them, just because it felt so impersonal, you know, bringing someone in and they might be nervous about what's going to happen. And then it's like everyone's masked. In the beginning, it was like face shields and gloves. Like it was just so intense as we all experienced. So we tried to do whatever we could to make it feel more like personal and familiar.
Thank you. And so the amount of innovation we've seen within our industry over the last few years has been impressive, to put it lightly. Stephanie just provided a few examples of how we can use and adapt technology solutions to solve a problem, which is actually a really great segue into my next question. So are there any technologies that you use for virtual research that were game changing? And Stephanie, I'll just go ahead, since we were just kind of talking about tech, go ahead and sling it back to you first.
Yeah, one thing that was a big challenge for us for the remote research was how to be able to see what we needed to see when talking through, you know, a webcam like this, for example. Like if we're wanting to see someone interact with a pre-filled syringe, which is an example I gave before, like you're not holding it up in the air and injecting it like this. Like we use simulated skin and someone has it, for example, on their abdomen or their thigh. So we had to think about ways to get the views that we wanted. In some cases, in earlier stage research, we could have people kind of like position the webcam, which is not incredibly innovative, but just was okay for that sort of research. But for certain types of research where it was later stage, or there was just a desire to collect like really meticulous data, we did something similar to the service it sounds like April was describing with the AV sort of like setup crew. There were some services that we used where it was basically a full sort of like AV setup in a box that they could mail to people. And it had a variety of cameras and a laptop, and someone could sort of like turn on the laptop, and I believe a service would join and help someone to configure the setup. So that was really useful if you were needing to get a variety of different angles. And also, yeah, you know, in lieu of someone else doing that tech setup, like we were signing on early to help people and like make sure everything was working well. So that's definitely a challenge. The other thing we did in one case was there was a product that a company was unable to distribute to people due to legal reasons, legal restrictions. And so in addition to research, our company has a design team as well. And the design team created a digital representation of the product that someone could interact with. So I will say the interactions for this weren't incredibly intense. It was more like looking at the packaging and unboxing and like getting those sorts of interpretations. But because of that sort of innovation, like we didn't have to ship anything. People could just sign in and we'd do a screen share and people could interact with the product that way. And we were able to get really great feedback because yeah, people were able to look at and do some basic interactions with the product without actually needing to send it to them.
That's awesome. And it sounds like there were some really good technologies out there that sort of supported this. But what I took from that is that in-person research would have been so much easier to manage, because just the AV setup and multiple cameras and making sure you're getting the angles, it's a huge undertaking. So, you know, we've been talking about when will in-person research return? When is it coming back? And again, this just proves some research is suitable for that and some would be better remote. And these examples you just shared, let's get it back to in-person, because that sounds like a pain in the rear end. So Amy, I'm gonna go ahead and send the same question your way. Were there any technologies that proved to be game-changing?
I'll just start and say that, like, luckily I didn't have to deal with any of the AV testing stuff for our products. I'll say that the only technology that comes to mind is that our project was designed knowing, like from the get-go, that our staff were at different locations, working across different time zones. And so what's really integral is our SharePoint site, which is our document management system. And it just kind of like spits out workflows and task lists and timelines. And so people can see their to-do list and everything. And it just keeps all of our projects super organized and really makes people like aware of everything. So I think that was like super critical as we transition to fully remote. That's like, I would say is probably the sole reason why we transitioned with like no difficulty. But that's not necessarily like game changing. So.
I mean, it is. Yeah, I think it is, because April really talked about the paperwork aspect, and considering the work you do is all paperwork. I am expecting an internal technology that can really help you organize and structure that. To me, that would be game changing. And that would be something that can be applied to you and your organization or any organization, because we all know there's going to be lots and lots of paperwork to handle, and it needs to be set up in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, well, if you guys would like to know, I can speak a little bit more about it. It just like, I think the key features is that we have like folder systems and everything's organized and nestled in. I think my favorite feature is that when I log on to our project site, I have a personalized homepage with all of my to-do lists outlined right there in front of me. And then we also have automated task lists. So when I mark off one of my tasks, my colleague is automatically notified via email that they can begin work. And so it just makes everything work smoothly.
Thank you for the elaboration, because, our discussion isn't only about how do you adapt research, but it's how do you adapt those internal processes to make us all more successful on the research side. It doesn't have to be, one direction or the other. It can definitely be shared. So now we've discussed how research methodology selection had to pivot and what strategies, both remote and in person, have proven successful. So now let's talk about recruiting participants. At L&E, we know our panel and we know what we're capable of accomplishing. Our gauge on providing accurate and reliable feasibility prior to project commencement is expert level, but the world changed and everyone had to adapt. We could no longer rely on what we knew. So April, I'm going to give you a very loaded question here. How was recruitment during the pandemic? Did you encounter any unexpected challenges in healthcare recruitment? I can't even imagine. You must have had trouble securing healthcare professionals for research, either remote or in person, due to the demands of healthcare providers during a global pandemic. Scheduling must have been a doozy. Please tell me about that.
So I'm actually going to probably surprise you with what I'm about to say. I found, and I have to say my team would probably agree, that the most challenging aspect in determining feasibility and working with clients on the front end to get projects in the door often boil down to being a myth buster per se, and clearing up a lot of misinformation regarding what the temperature truly was within the healthcare field versus the sensationalized perceived climate among specifically healthcare providers during the pandemic. That was a challenge. We're fortunate at L&E to have medical professionals on the team to kind of have like an insider look as to what is going on in boots on the ground in our local market specifically. So we spoke to countless clients who were feeling quite defeated and overwhelmed over those years over the need to potentially halt their research, requiring any and all healthcare providers during the height of the pandemic. But this was simply unnecessary. It's important to remember that a very small percentage of physicians and advanced care providers actually work in acute care settings. So speaking of physicians, DOs, MDs, PAs, NPs, therapists, unless you are testing emergency cardiology, pulmonology, anesthesiology, or like the hospitalist intensivist service lines, the pandemic actually couldn't have been a better time to conduct your research, as the majority of preventative and elective care medicine slowed, some to a full halt. I can tell you that if you wanted to talk to a plastic surgeon, there was no better time to talk to a plastic surgeon than 2020 to 2021. Many providers seeing patients in clinic experienced downtime between patients because their schedules were spanned due to keep social distancing and clean waiting areas. Telemedicine was birthed, to the hilt and provided providers with at-home work environments, many for the first time ever in front of computers in their home, with gaps in their days typically. So there was no greater time to easily catch and schedule these providers than in those couple years. I would also like to plug that if you're a team supporting research plagued by fair, and I put fair in quotes, and I'm sure the majority of those listening understand why, fair market value, there's no greater time to conduct that research and in the throes of a global pandemic, as providers' schedules were often clear, making them more likely to accept a lower than standard honorarium because they were not blocking off clinic hours to participate. Oftentimes their clinic hours were already blocked off for other reasons. So just something to keep in mind in the future. Now, there is a flip side to this in talking about the difficulties. And there were several provider types who we did need to use more care in engaging with and ultimately advocated for them during this time. And those were primarily our nurses, who the opposite holds true for. The majority of nurses are employed in an acute care field. And during the pandemic, it did not matter your specialty. It didn't matter if you were a cardiology nurse, a med surg nurse, an OB nurse, you were in high demand. So others such as first responders, respiratory therapists, perfusionists, and the big one that's forgotten is the phlebotomists and the lab techs. That's who's staffing all of these drive-in COVID screening sites. Those were recruitable, but we had to just handle them with a little bit more care, advocate for a more flexible schedule, increase the incentive because they're tired, just to make their time more worth their while. But that is pertaining to the true frontline workers during those years. And I will say our show rates were great. They remained high, 97 to 98%. It was a great time for market research to engage healthcare workers. And sometimes we really tried to stay, and something we really tried to stay on top of, and educating our clients in the methodology solutions to continue that forward progress of their studies, given the availability of the providers was there. And then healthcare provider side, switching gears to our patient and caregivers, of course, we were in a position to really advocate for and protect those in an at-risk population. So even if they were open and willing to participate, we would still kind of raise a flag and talk to our clients to come up with manners in which we could make the research happen, but in a safe manner. So our facility team members were absolutely fantastic in ensuring that every patient and caregiver was attended to, met where they were at, made you feel comfortable and confident in our aseptic practices to keep them and their loved ones safe. That said, there were particular populations that we would not chance it on. So our COPDers, our neutropenics, our CF patients, our immunocompromised patients, cancer patients, and our elderly folks, we would work around those and either find a way to perform that study remote, or don't forget your proxies, don't forget your surrogates. There are a lot of conditions out there that are hot, but that there are really suitable patient populations who are not at risk, who have the same pathophysiologies, have the same symptomatologies, who are much more available and less at risk for contracting a potentially contagious disease if brought in sight. So that was something we always advocate for with these rare patients to protect them in general, but in the height of COVID, that was really something we took forward and progressed onward, and we really found that made a big difference and able to top off quotas as needed to move market research forward. But all in all, we really just took each study as it came and worked to make it make sense for the times, for the target audience, for the market mandates at the time, because there were moments where all of our markets, they had something different going on. This has masks, this has social distancing, this one's completely locked down after this month. So we really had to kind of keep up with that and just work day in and day out on a case-by-case basis. One other aspect I did want to touch on are health assessments, contact precautions, and screenings in present day. So now that local mandates are lifted, we really allow our clients to drive what we're going to do on site based on their comfort level, their company's policies, their experiences, their personal preferences. And we use those as a guide to how we would like to go about hosting and conducting the on-site research. So that said, I did feel it might be helpful for anyone unsure as to, hey, what is everybody else doing right now as we're emerging, to make everybody aware of what we're seeing on probably like 95% of our in-person research proceedings as of today. So regarding health assessments, and what I'm referring to are the verbal COVID screenings that accompany the initial qualifying screening. Those are going by the wayside for close to 3 years now. We've seen on every screener, we get a screener and there's COVID screening at the time of screening. But the reason this is going by the wayside is that the majority of recruitment for healthcare occurs with enough lead time to make the disclosure of exposure and symptoms essentially irrelevant on the day of research. If this is something that is a policy for your team, your sponsoring client teams, we really recommend, there's no real reason to screen for that. On the front end, let's do a 24 to 48 hour call prior to their study date. That's when this matters. That's when exposure matters. That's where symptoms matter. Screening for that 2 to 3 weeks, in advance just lengthens the screening time and ultimately is typically irrelevant. Regarding vaccine status and screening and COVID testing on site or proof of vaccines, these are rarely screened for and are required by the majority of our clients at this point. We did see a spike in these practices within the first year with the vaccine being widely circulated and testing being widely available. But this is now very rarely requested. However, this is always dependent on patient population, the client's team comfort level, and their internal policies. And all of that should be taken into consideration and respected. And we do execute on a project by project basis. Lastly, I wanted to discuss something a little bit of a different pace, and that is panel integrity. And a final enhanced innovation per se incorporated throughout the pandemic by LNE, which was the process of digitally vetting your respondents. It is very important, and LNE takes a great deal of pride in never losing sight of the work our research supports. So healthcare providers and the patients who contribute to these discussions and these conversations are shaping the future of medicine worldwide. So that data is only as valuable as the quality of the respondent providing it. So we have a no compromise digital vetting system in place to validate all recruited HCPs, that they are who they say they are, and their licenses are in active and good standing. And we don't care that we talked to you 6 months ago, 9 months ago, 12 months ago. We're still going to go and we're going to do our behind the scenes work to make sure that nothing has happened since then. And you are who you say you are, and that nothing has happened with your license since we last spoke to you. And then for our patients, we have manners in which to quickly verify they are diagnosed with what they say they are diagnosed with, and if applicable, are prescribed what they say they have been prescribed. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that there is a direct correlation between participant fraud attempts and directly with economic unrest. So in the pandemic times, and arguably times we're in now, we have noted an uptick in these attempts. And to be clear, they're just that, they're attempts. But it's really important that if you're partnering with a client or you are a vendor and you yourself are doing your own recruitment, that you really do have these processes in place to catch them on the front end, just to make sure that your data remains pure and that you are talking to who you think you're talking to, because ultimately this is important work that we're all doing. And I just wanted to kind of plug that as a little extra note on this, that it is something that we've seen over the past couple years, is an increase in fraudulent or attempting to be fraudulent participants. And that if you don't know your process, if you don't have a process, or you're not sure what the process of your partnering vendor supplying recruitment for you is, to definitely dig into that, just to make sure that you're getting what you need.
Thank you, April. That was really, really good information. And I mean, we've talked about panel fraud so much over the past couple of years. It's always been in the industry in the background, but to your point, I like the point you made about it increasing during economic hardships, because when people are having trouble making ends meet, then they might be a little less honest. So yeah, I fully agree that these processes are so critical to not just the research that LNE assists with, but research in general. It's an industry-wide conversation. So Amy, what was your experience? So LNE does support some of your patient recruitment, as you mentioned earlier, but you have your own panel of experts on the clinician and researcher side. So April kind of elaborated on our experience with our panel, but did you find recruitment to be a challenge with any of the audiences you internally recruited?
Yeah, so I'll just echo April's earlier comments. Really not too many challenges unless we were focusing on topics like emergency department use or just like trying to get some of those acute care clinicians. And I'll just also say that like we've worked with our panelists for multiple years now, and we initially recruited them from like our staff network and snowball recruitment, having them recommend colleagues. And so we do have a very engaged panel database of panelists who are like willing to like participate, and we've worked on their developing that relationship over the years. So they also know that like if they have something going on in their lives, they can always ask for an extension and we will just be flexible on our end. And so we have about like 2 weeks to synthesize reviewer feedback. So we just kind of eat into our own time, just give them as much time as they need to complete the reviewer form, and we'll just kind of accommodate their needs.
Yeah, that flexibility is critical. And I think we've all learned, I think our fun words for today are flexibility and adaptation, because they've been so important. If you're not able to keep on your toes, then research is going to continue without you. So it really is important that you've made those adjustments and allowed that flexibility, even if it came at a cost of, you having to rush some work at the very end of it. So then, now thinking of the recruits that are sourced from another party, such as your friends at L&E, were there any audience that you needed to speak with that were in high demand but low supply from recruiting providers? And this could be professionals or patient populations. I know April kind of touched on some of those. Amy or Stephanie, did either of you have this experience? And before I pass the mic, are there any potential challenging audiences that are still a challenge? Or has that now passed? And I'm going to let one of you jump in, either whoever feels comfortable.
Yeah, so April, I think what you said made a lot of sense of who was most busy early COVID versus not quite so busy. I had the experience of working on a ventilator project and also a monitor defibrillator project. The monitor defibrillator being used by EMTs and paramedics, like pre-hospital. And so we were able to recruit people, but especially for the first responders, we were seeing really high cancellation rates because people were getting pulled into overtime shifts. Like they were just really last minute being asked to come in for another shift. So we ended up, recruiting slightly more than we usually would have, or like needing to last minute replace people. I wouldn't say that it really held up the research, but it was just, obviously you want those types of people to be helping real people in the real world, and coming to us when they're available. So on the clinician side, that was a little bit of a challenge. We did have some studies that would involve patients like with respiratory illnesses, and some of the more acute ones, especially like people obviously didn't want to put themselves at risk by going to, especially early on, like any sort of public place. So in some cases we used some proxies, as you had discussed, April. In other cases, the research just was not able to proceed sort of as planned. So I think April and L&E team, you'd probably have a better sense for if those types of folks are still having hesitations and how productive or that sort of research can be right now based on people's comfort. But I know as a researcher, we'd never want to put someone in an uncomfortable position. And also, as you had touched on, like, even if they feel comfortable, it's like, okay, do we feel comfortable actually bringing these people in? So I see that as potentially a continued recruiting challenge.
I'll just share, I don't think anything really comes to mind for our method of testing. We've been able to recruit most of our clinicians and patients related to certain health topics. I will say that I've seen an uptick in research studies funded by Precautions, our client, that focus on mental health services and telehealth services as a result of COVID, but I wouldn't say we've had difficulties recruiting for those topics.
Thank you. And then, so, before we start wrapping up, we're going to kind of tie this all up in a bow with what have we learned. So Amy, I'm going to start with you. Most of your work was conducted remotely prior to stay-at-home orders. So what have you learned? Is there anything that you or your organization have implemented?
Like you mentioned earlier, just being flexible and adaptive. Internally, we review our processes to see how they can be improved. So we ensure all of our internal training documents and resources are up to date. We also ensure our staff are cross-trained across different activities. And so the team that I manage, they have their specific tasks, but then they've also received training for the other roles. So for example, our memo writers who analyze the panelist feedback are also able to step in and fill in for our recruitment manager who coordinates the product testing and communicates with the panelists. And all this allows for the project to continue to run smoothly and accommodate any staff absences. And then externally, we always ask our panelists for feedback to hear directly from them on what could be improved. So in every reviewer form, there's an opportunity for folks to give us feedback. And also at the end of the year, we send a thank you email, but we also ask them to complete a survey just to collect more feedback and just anything else they want to share. So in summary, just trying to be proactive and improve before being forced to change.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think the bigger conversation as we are as an industry should be having is, what do we need to be doing to treat our panelists better and to make their experience more robust? Just giving them the opportunity to provide that feedback, I think, is really valuable. And I like that you're adapting your processes and, learning as you go. So Stephanie, I'm going to flip the same question to you. We know a lot changed for you in your organization. So what have you learned?
I think the major thing is that, on a positive note, it was heartening to feel like we could all sort of come together and adapt and conduct research in difficult times. I was sort of reflecting on how things were really early, the summer 2020 when things were still in a really heightened state, and thinking about all of the different ways that we adapted with cleaning protocols and various PPE and distancing. Just so much went into that. So I think collectively it just to reflect, it felt good to feel like we were able to adapt. As far as what we sort of take with us in having to adapt and investigate some of these other remote research opportunities, I think because we've proven that they can be effective in certain situations, we could perhaps be more open to those sorts of opportunities. For example, if there's budgetary restrictions, if there's a difficult patient population to recruit. So instead of bouncing around to 5 cities, for example, could we conduct this remotely? And we've just had the opportunity basically to work through the different methodologies to feel confident that that will be effective. So I think that's the big one. There are some more rare cases, but some cases where the devices that we're researching, someone is sort of accustomed to using that device for an extended period on their own. And we need to do really careful observations. So in some cases, observing from the back room has been helpful. The vast majority not, but that was sort of an interesting insight of, if there's a trained professional used to, in our case, we work on some reprocessing or intensive cleaning of endoscopes, someone's just used to spending 3 hours working with the equipment on their own. If we can be not really in their face and be in the back room, that helps the realism of the situation.
And so April, I'm going to sling it over to you. What are you hearing when it comes to new requests and conversations you're having with healthcare researchers?
Yeah, so I think we are seeing a divided group. We've got, I would say, probably a 30-70. So we've got probably the 30%. We're seeing clients leaning more into their online platform capabilities, kind of like what Stephanie described as they figured it out. They developed out of necessity over the past 2 years. A lot of times they did cost a lot of money that these clients were not expecting to pay. And so they're leaning into the advantages of this and not having to pay for travel and having to pay for, to put people up in hotels and do all of that. So they're further enhancing those experiences because they work for them. But I would say that is the smaller of the group. I would say probably 70% we're seeing clients running as quickly as possible to get back into facilities and back to business as usual. I would say that is definitely the governing trend, which is really encouraging. Remote moderation was great. Home usage is great. all of those things are great. And I feel very blessed that we all have that in our back pocket now and are very well versed in it. So forbid we ever find ourselves in these types of situations further on in our career, we have them. But nothing will ever replace clients in the facility doing the work. And I think that that's the message. And it's encouraging, in my opinion, that the art of market research remains alive, and that the roots and talking to the recruits are well rooted in communication, and just that interaction remains, and that yearning for that interaction, that one-on-one, hasn't been able to be replaced. So I think that that's great for all of us.
Thank you. So, we're kind of running close on time. There's not much in the Q&A. So if you do have a question, go ahead and drop that in here and we'll answer it before we wrap up. But before we do that, I would like to thank you all for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. We're going to take some questions if they come in, but first I'd like to take a brief moment to thank Focus Forward, our transcription partner who so graciously volunteered to transcribe this webinar for free. Focus Forward is just one of our tech partners that we've partnered with to bring complete qualitative and quantitative solutions to our client. We will be emailing out a link to the recording of this webinar, or you can download a copy of the transcript, all of which can be found at our website at www.leresearch.com/resources. That'll be up in a few days to a week. And you can also learn more about our partners, such as Focus Forward and a host of other solutions we offer at our website as well, all aimed to help you execute your research with one phone call or email. So let's see, any questions? Yes, we have a question in here. So I would love to know, of the participants on this call, how many have gone back to in-person at all? So I guess Stephanie definitely has. And Amy, have you? I don't think you've done any in-person back yet, right?
No.
Yeah.
So I think the questioner might have meant the audience on the call, and to that I can't speak. So if you guys want to chime in on the chat, please feel free. But go ahead, Stephanie. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, so we've been in person for quite a long time, though in person could mean in that back room. I'd say COVID feels like a blur, doesn't it? But maybe at least a year that we've been in the same room with people. But that could mean, masking, obviously, like keeping a distance. At times we had barriers. So I'd say in the past 6 months, maybe, things have felt more like truly normal, of like being at a table with someone more closely, and not having a lot of precautions in place, besides, as April was describing, like the screening that we're doing in advance. I see another related question, which is what types of safety measures or procedures have been put in the in-person testing room? Yeah, we had a real lot. Let me see if I can remember them. So a lot of PPE in the beginning. We had masks and face shields. We had plastic barriers. We were keeping our distance. In the beginning, societally, we weren't sure if COVID transmitted via touch. So for a long time, the assumption was that it could. And so we were wearing gloves. We were very intensively wiping every surface down, wiping down the chairs, wiping down everything, documenting our cleaning protocols, assessing. We had air purifiers plentifully, which are hard to ship and travel with, but we did. Also sort of like an internal procedure to assess if just the general safety level of conducting the research, if it was appropriate. I think we all remember that times were changing very quickly, kind of also, as April discussed, also in different places, like how do we make the right decision? So we had quite a lot, and it does feel good. I was looking back at some pictures of how we had this set up, like sort of early days, and I was like, wow, we actually have come a long way here. So that felt good.
I don't think oh, sorry, Kelly.
Oh, I was just going to chime in, on the L&E side, which may have been where April was about to go. We had plexiglass dividers, we had electrostatic air sprayers. We even put hands-free door things on all the doors so
Yeah.
you could use your foot to open them and you didn't have to touch anything. We converted our incentive processes to paperless. All of our processes actually got, most of them got to no touch.
Right.
April, sorry.
I was just going to say, none of us will ever look at plexiglass the same again after the outfitting of the facilities and such.
Awesome. Well, so I really hate to let this panel go, but we promised an hour, so we're not going to keep anybody over that. We could probably keep talking for another hour, but thank you so much, Amy, Stephanie, and April. And thank you everyone out there in our audience that joined today. Remember, we're going to email you links to the content and you can find it on our website, but thank you everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully in person. Have a great day.
Thank you.